My name is Michael Menasgotz, and this short video will overview the evidence I discovered proving that Jesus' gospel message originates from the Roman government. It all relates to Emperor Vespasian around the AD 70s. Having gained the throne, he had the motive, means, and opportunity to create a story about Jesus in which he or his son could be presented as the second coming. So the motive was that he had just ended 2 wars and become the emperor by defeating his enemies. He needed those wars not to reignite, so he needed the loyalty of the legions and the Jews that he had just defeated so they wouldn't revolt again. It was life or death for him because he didn't want to die like his 4 recent predecessors. He certainly had the means to do it. He could promote a new religion, he could have a new good news story created, he could promote it, create temples, attract people into it, and this story could teach people to await Jesus' second coming, enabling him or his son to be promoted and worshipped as that second coming. He also had the opportunity, because he was a dictator, his family had just destroyed Jerusalem, which was believed to be the physical seat of the Jewish God on earth, so the Jews would be open to a new direction for their faith. Their solution was ingenious. They needed a story that people would be attracted to. Once drawn into the temples that would be established, the early church, they could be led to see that Jesus is the Son of God. It's at step 3 that it gets really clever. They would reveal evidence showing that the only plausible candidate for the second coming is the emperor. In the temples, these followers could then be led to worship the emperor as God, and they'd become hooked on that. They'd become emperor worshippers. And the 4th step was then necessary to achieve pure emperor worshippers, because you then need to remove faith in Jesus, and let's see how it can be done. What's not obvious is that Jesus' entire story is parallel to the official account of the Roman Emperor Titus, as published in their official record, Jewish War. Those parallels were first publicly described by Joe Atwill. It turns out that when you specifically look at the Gospel of Luke, they're actually in the same order. You can find this remarkable sequence where the parallel activities of Titus and Jesus are strung out through both stories in much the same order. This could be the evidence that would be used to guide followers to see the Emperor Titus as the second coming of Jesus. So that was that second step. Let's look at the next one. Revealing proof that the government invented Jesus. The solution was to make Luke and Jewish War parody each other. And indeed, the locations of those parallels form a pattern. This was the biggest discovery of my research. Over 4 years, I catalogued the locations of all these parallels, plotted them to see if there was a pattern, and it's specifically in the Gospel of Luke that this pattern emerges. I suspect that the first and lost version of Jewish War was half as long. It was the second half, and it spelt out these lines of parallels, spell out the letters VS for Vespasian. The second version tells us that there was an earlier version that was the paternal tongue. That's the father's version, not a translation. And we can see that in the first half of Jewish War, only Jewish War parodies Luke. We don't see much of Luke parodying Jewish War. And we can see that that first half is a later addition. It's not even about the same topic. It's not in the same writing style. And that helps us see that the original message was that of Vespasian, and that Titus had the second version of Jewish War produced to give a different message. That's the Latin word apt, aptus, meaning fit, or he who is fit to be in the heavens. Why choose the word aptus? The A and the P is easily identified as the Holy Ghost in the Greek text of the Gospels. It's agion pneuma. So one possibility is that it's Holy Spirit Titus. It's linked to the text in Luke, he who is apt to have his place in God's kingdom. A few verses later, after the end of Luke, we've got rejoice, your names are written in heaven, and that's a clue. This is about the firmament, this is about the stars, and that brings us to John 1. It talks about this very important logos, an image of God's name shining in the darkness. And that leads me to think that this may have been intended to represent the stars aligning to form the emperor's name. This is backed up by the Slavonic Josephus version of Jewish War, talking about Jesus' nativity story and describing the star that led the Magi to Jesus as a star image. So Where are these parallels? There's a huge number. I spent 4 years cataloging them and plotting them. They're all in my book. They're all in my published paper. You can find all the details there. This is the most classic example. It was one of the ones published by Joe Atwill. It describes both protagonists at Lake Galilee. That's Jesus in Luke, or Commander Titus before he became emperor in Jewish War. Both of them arrive at Lake Galilee. Both of them present themselves. Both of them have the protagonist walking on the shore and then giving news to their father, naval vessels sinking, a huge catch being made after a failed catch for dawn, at least one Jew jumping out of the ship, a huge number being enclosed. And Jesus says at Lake Galilee that he will make his disciples become fishers of men in the future. And it's in the future, in this story in Jewish War, that Titus does make his men become fishers of men, literally spearing men in the water of Lake Galilee, cutting their throats like fish. The parallels continue. I've coloured them in, you can read them, and as I click through there are so many that it is undeniable once you've seen all these parallels that at least one of them is written to parody or parable the other. And on the bottom left I'm just plotting their locations. So if I click through, you can see more and more parallels, and you can see them building up. I'm just plotting their locations, and this forms this pattern. You can refer to my longer video, which goes into more detail, or my paper or my book. But clicking through all these parallels, you can see identified most of the parallels of that first sequence, but there's more to come. So most of those related to this revelation that Titus was supposed to be Jesus' second coming. This was then going to be followed by a final revelation, all done in secrecy within the temples under oath of secrecy. That makes it a secrecy cult effectively. But this final revelation was to then show the emperor worshippers that Jesus was nothing more than a parable about Emperor Titus. And it's revealing that the two stories parody each other, and their parallels form this message showing that it's intentional. And that proves that they had to have been written together. That's because whilst you can parody somebody else's story, you can't make somebody else's story be a parody of your story back. You'd have to have editorial control over both. The logic forces us to the conclusion that the two stories have a common origin. The origin of Jewish war is undeniably the Roman government. Therefore, it follows that the story in Luke is too. So that's the final step that would enable the priests to lead the worshippers to become pure emperor worshippers. So I'll carry on clicking through these. There isn't time to read them. Refer to my longer video for some of them, or my paper for more of them, or my book if you want all the evidence in one place. Clicking through more of them, huge number of parallels, all documented over a 4-year period. And as I work through them, you can see this pattern slowly emerging. We've got the S has now merged. This next sequence of parallels relates to Exodus 12. It's different from the other two. Whilst Luke parodies Jewish war, and Jewish war parodies Luke, we've also got some parallels where both stories are evoking Exodus 12. That's the Passover ritual, and those are shown in red up there. The blue ones are Luke parodying Jewish war, and the black ones are Jewish war parodying Luke. So that's how that pattern is formed. These parallels relate to things like Jesus' bones not being broken to evoke the requirement of Passover that the lamb's bones must not be broken. Joe Atwill himself identified the Mary in Jewish war who sacrifices her baby son and eats him and declares him a sacrifice for the Jewish people, which is again a parody of the sacrifice of Jesus as God's lamb. When you plot those parallels relating to Exodus 12 Passover ritual, all of them align with the Aptus pattern. There are no exceptions, and we can use that later as one of the several ways to demonstrate the Aptus pattern is genuine. Clicking through more parallels, again, this took years to collate. One of the most extraordinary parallels is how Josephus' story itself serves as a parody of Jesus, which enables us to doubt that Josephus is anything than a propaganda model for teaching Jews that they should switch to the Roman side. So those are just clicking through them. I mean, there are really obvious ones, such as that Josephus spends 2 days in a cavern that is a grave which is shaped like a sepulchre, and he spends 2 days in it only to be raised alive on the 3rd day by a man who is deified as a god. 3 days in a sepulchre, then being raised alive on the third day by God. It's clearly Jesus' story. And there are so many parallels between Josephus' story and Jesus's that we can identify the entirety of it as a parody of Jesus' story. This one, for example, has Josephus again on Lake Galilee, again with boats, and there are so many parallels that we can see that Jewish war is parodying how Luke parodies itself. It's circular, and it's intentionally circular, with the purpose being that it can later be shown that the two documents have the same origin. Here I'm just showing where those parallels are, those ones mainly involving Josephus. They're not scattered at random throughout the documents, they are clustered, and they help form the T and the V of the aptus pattern, and that helps show that this is intentional. It is not coincidences. More parallels, they're all in my paper, all in my book. Those ones form this incredibly well-defined line of the A of aptus. We can use this, it's actually very convenient to use this, because we can simulate how many parallels there would need to be before we can pick out such a well-defined line. It turns out there'd need to be at least 2,000 coincidental parallels that appear to involve one document parodying the other. That's extraordinary. If each parallel generally involves at least 2 verses of Luke, that would require 4,000 verses of Luke to be filled with seemingly noteworthy parallels purely by coincidence, and that's physically impossible because Luke only has 1,100 or so verses. So we can rule out that scenario where I, as a researcher, might have been finding patterns in noise. So that's one way of showing that the aptus pattern is genuine. Another aspect that needs evaluating is whether perhaps all the parallels as a whole are coincidences. Maybe they coincidentally form a pattern, and that's actually quite easy to rule out as well. You can see in my book the maths I use to show the odds of this, simply evaluating whether such parallels could form a pattern of that form, symbolically meaningful and well-spaced and well-defined. The odds of that are 1 in 100 billion, 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 billion. We can also use the clustering and the alignment of that third sequence, the Exodus ones, again 1 in 300,000 billion, billion, that they would all align with the Exodus pattern. And I also found a series of parallels published over a decade ago by Cliff Carrington. This was pointed out later. Enough of them align that it becomes very implausible that this would happen coincidentally to the odds of 1 in a million. All of this detail is described in a bit more detail in my longer video and even more detail in my book. So those parallels, no time to read them. They complete the P. It's all in my paper. It's all in my book. In terms of the timeline, Vespasian and Titus crush Judea and reclaim it. Vespasian becomes emperor. They plan this whole strategy to convince both Jews and legionaries to be attracted to Jesus and then see the emperor as the second coming. They publish those stories. Vespasian dies. Titus continues the project before he also dies. With their deaths, early Christianity remaining quite niche and small, and that continues with successors such as Nerva and other emperors later having no interest in promoting worship of their predecessors. This continues until Constantine. He decides a historical Jesus is useful. It makes people render taxes to the emperor. Following that, obviously the early church needed to suppress this information. It was a threat to their rule, and that explains why the early church was so paranoid. It explains why the Bible was only published in a language that people couldn't read. Nowadays, that has probably been forgotten, and it was only the work of Joe Atwill which has allowed us to see these parallels. And so in summary, it's really because the two stories parody each other in such incredible detail that we can show that they have the same origin, and that enables us to show that the origin of Luke has to be the same as the origin of Jewish war, which is undeniably the Roman government. By showing mathematically that this cannot be finding patterns in noise, it enables us to rule out anything other than the parallels being intentional. Therefore, the parodies are intentional, so it's unavoidable that the two stories were written together. The fact they're written together means that Jesus' story in the Gospels originates from the Roman government. For more information, see my longer video, find my paper on academia.edu, or my book, Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. Thanks for watching. Please do like the video, subscribe, and if you found it interesting, please do watch the longer video.